Okay. All right. A good morning, afternoon, evening to those that are joining us today. My name is Kevin Mahal. I'm a Senior Technical Program Manager for the Microsoft Partnership here at TechSoup. Today, in our second session of The Art of the Impossible in Action, Turning Data into Decisions, we are joined by the fine folks from our friends, our partner, Tech Impact. So in today's session, which is, of course, going to be is being recorded, and you will be getting a copy of, along with the slide deck. There's some general housekeeping. Mentioned the items on the far left that, again, you will be receiving this copy of this in the coming days. For the live session itself, for chat, we understand that there is chat, there is Q&A. Some people like chat, some people like Q&A. It's chocolate, it's vanilla, it's whatever your favorite flavor is. If you are using the chat to ask questions, if you could kindly please use the letter Q in advance of your question to better draw attention to it. Comments and reactions, obviously, for chat as well. During this session, we do have microphones muted. There's going to be a portion for Q&A. We'll be able to unmute individuals to ask questions at that time, should they wish to come off mute. Cameras have been disabled. Just makes it a little bit easier to track this recording. If we get to that point in the Q&A and you would like to speak, and we've got a couple of people, it looks like, coming in the pipeline, we'll kick it old school by a little digital hand raising. After the live session, there's also going to be an opportunity to provide feedback to us in the form of a survey. This is critical. I had a lot of follow-up outreach. I don't know if any of you guys did, but I probably had a half a dozen emails regarding different Azure services, other pieces and parts around what was discussed. It was absolutely awesome. So survey results, outreach back to us, to our partners. This is important because this is really for you. Like, we're here presenting something, but at the end of the day, the power and the capability that AI has to transform organizations is a two-person process, if you will. It's the person telling the story, and it's the person listening to the story, so that they can go back out and then tell their story in a way that makes the most sense to them. So with that, I am going to jump over to the Tech Impact team to take it away from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin. Really good to see everyone. If you were here with us last week, good to see you again. If you're here with us for the first time, lovely to meet you. My name's Ryan Harrington. Really happy to be here representing Tech Impact. If you're not familiar with our work, just to really briefly go over it, we are a nonprofit that serves other nonprofits to help you all leverage technology to advance your own social impact. And we do that in a lot of different ways. Certainly webinars are a key piece of that, but we also are a team of technologists who want to help make that possible for other people. My team in particular is our data lab team at Tech Impact. So this webinar is really near and dear to our heart. We help nonprofits answer questions like, are you even collecting the right data? Are you storing it the right way? Have you developed the reports on it? Are you thinking about more advanced analytics? All in the name of making your work easier so that you can meet your mission a little bit more effectively. A little bit more introduction here, and we'll be brief because I know some of you got to meet us last week. Like I said, I'm Ryan Harrington, and I lead our data lab team. My background is as a data scientist, and so I spent a lot of my career doing this work, particularly the analytics side of that work, for a pretty wide variety of customers, and I'm really thrilled to be able to do that for nonprofits today. Dharneesh?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dharneesh, and I'm the lead data engineer at Tech Impact. I specialize in designing and developing data pipelines, ETLs, and other data infrastructure needs. I'll pass it over to Matt.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Matt. I'm an application developer at Tech Impact. I focus on data implementations, integrations, CRM, all things Microsoft. Prior to Tech Impact, I worked for Microsoft for 10 years.
Awesome. Thank you both. And so for most of the day, you're going to be stuck with me. I'll be helping guide you through some of the learning, as particularly around data engineering types of topics, data infrastructure types of topics. And then throughout the conversation today, at two major points, we'll be doing some demos of some of the technologies we'll be talking about, and Dharneesh and Matt will jump back in to help talk through some of those moments. So that brings us to today. Last week, we spent our time thinking about the art of the possible. So what actually is possible to accomplish with technology? We introduced, or with data even more specifically, we introduced a few different areas to think about as part of that. So we spent some time talking about predictive analytics, everything from descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, prescriptive, the different types of predictive analytics. And then we spent the back half of our conversation thinking a little bit about artificial intelligence, specifically with Azure AI Foundry and some of the things you could do with that, both for agents and for AI search. So a lot of different technologies that we talked about. And that gives you a good understanding of what you could do with it. But the reality is that none of those things are possible without thinking through your data strategy from the perspective of the data infrastructure that's required to make that happen. So that's our entire goal for today. It's how do we make the art of the possible? And that is going to be covered in a few different ways. One, we're going to revisit the data lifecycle. We spent 3 minutes talking about that last week, really as an interlude into this week. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth to make sure that you have a pretty clear understanding of the components of that. Technology is a huge enabler of making that happen. And there's a lot of technologies at Microsoft in particular that make that feasible for you. So we want to make sure you have a clear understanding of that as well. And then the underpinning of all the infrastructure is this idea of governance. And it's probably one of the most important topics we could talk about, regardless of where your own organization is from a data maturity perspective. Governance should be top of mind for you. And we want you to be thoughtful about what that can look like and how to right size that to you, regardless of where you're at in your journey. And last, thinking about how can you actually address that and the levers that you can pull there. One of the big underpinning pieces that I talk about a lot as it comes to data and data infrastructure is that data is the ultimate expression of the idea of garbage in, garbage out. If you want to build an analytics solution at some point in time, it's only as good as the data that you're feeding into it. So if the data that you're feeding into it is bad, it's problematic in whatever way you want to define that, downstream when you go to report on that or to build a predictive model on that or use AI on that, whatever it is, you're going to have problems that it might trick you into thinking you're doing great when you're not. It might decrease trust in your end users, in the communities that you're serving, all because you didn't get the infrastructure you needed in place, the processes you needed in place to make sure you weren't collecting garbage data. Now, all of this goes back to the idea of data strategies. And similarly, we introduced this idea last week. So just to refresh you, a data strategy in our mind is something that you build in 6 steps. You make sure that you have clear understandings of the goals for your organization. How do you want to accomplish your mission over the course of the next several years? That's a classic type of strategy approach to take regardless of what you're doing. The next step in is how do you audit your data? In order to accomplish those goals, you need to take a step back and look at the data that you have and see if there's any limiting factors there that are going to stop you from reaching the goals that you're thinking about. You need to make sure that you have the right tools for the job, regardless of what that is. You all have an existing tech stack that you work from. How do you add to that in an appropriate way? How do you leverage the tools that you currently have even better than you're currently doing that? And what are the skills you need to make that happen as well? And then you implement, you build skills, and you evaluate. And so last time, what we talked about really focused in closer on the defining goals piece, because you have to be able to imagine what you could do with your technology as part of that goal setting process. And today we're going to focus in more on that auditing and tool selection process. So that's definitely a really important piece to go thinking about. Let's zero in on the data lifecycle. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in this first half of the conversation today is all going to tie back to this data lifecycle. And similarly, we introduced the idea before. Last week, we really zeroed in on talking about the analytics side of this. So the analytics is the end product that you are getting out of the data lifecycle. And to be clear, this is a simplified version of the data lifecycle. There's some other steps you might think about as part of your data management strategy overall. But the analytics piece is really where we thought about. We kind of did the begin with the end in mind type of step. And so thinking about that last week, that meant that we were talking about tools like Azure AI Foundry, analytics being AI in that particular case. Last week, of course, we also introduced Microsoft Fabric. We really talked about the analytics capabilities of Microsoft Fabric last time, but it turns out the other two steps that we have to go think about are generation and storage. And Fabric is actually phenomenal for that as well. So that's something that can be really useful. Also, I'm getting some feedback all of a sudden, and I'm not sure what it is. So if other people are hearing that, okay, awesome. That seems to have gone away. Fabric also helps with the storage component. Today, we're going to introduce the idea of Microsoft Synapse as well. You'll note that it covers some of the same types of steps. It is also an analytics solution, and it also helps with storage and extract, transformation, and loading. So really important tool, and we'll talk about the differences there. And then the last thing that we'll talk about, this goes back to governance as being a key piece, is we're going to introduce Microsoft Purview. And Microsoft Purview is a phenomenal tool to help think about how to govern the entire process and make sure you're very aware of what's going on in each one of these steps. For now, we're going to dive in one at a time. So we're going to iterate from step one into the different components of step two and talk about how you should be thinking about goals for your organization as it relates to that. So the right place to start is in step one with data generation. When I think about data generation, all of you are generating data right now in a lot of different ways. I don't even have to look at your organization to know what that looks like. It is your program data, it is finance data, it is donor data. It is all across your organizations in every different way possible. One of the major things that we see as a problem, I mentioned garbage in, garbage out. Well, if this data generation step isn't focused in on making sure that you are getting accurate and consistent data in a timely fashion, and I think that can be a really important component of this as well, you're probably setting yourself up for failure somewhere else down the line. And the exact way to solve that problem is going to be a little bit different for every single one of your organizations and every single one of the different tools that you're thinking about. But at a high level, something that you should be thinking about overall, regardless of where you're at in your journey, is asking yourself the question of, how do I move from manual data entry, where I'm requiring someone to go enter in the information by hand, to something that's more automated? The benefit of automated data collection systems is that across the board, that gives a much higher likelihood that the data that's being input is validated in some way. And we'll talk through a couple of different things later in terms of what you should think about in terms of data quality, particularly as we get towards the governance section of things. But that's a major piece that we see being problematic. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to get away from manual data entry. That could be a really important part of your practice and how you need to go about doing things. But in general, the more that you can automate, the more likelihood that you are going to have clean data that you can use for analysis down the line. So if you were part of last week's webinar, we spent a little bit of time talking about this donor management concept. And so we introduced this idea of this kind of fake organization that they're trying to get their arms wrapped around their donor data. Now, of course, you could apply this to whatever domain you want to, but it's just a good, consistent topic that we can think about for your organization. So the sample that we gave last week, one of them at least, was around, we want to be able to predict donor churn. So we want to know for each individual person that we're talking to, what is the likelihood, or who has donated to us, what is the likelihood that they are going to donate again? And if you recall from last week, that is an example of a predictive model, specifically a classification model, because we have two topics, a yes or a no for whether or not that they will answer, and that lets us predict. And we used a lot of different data sources to make that happen. We had past donation history, we had event attendance data, we had engagement with emails, and we had income data. And the reality is that all those different pieces of information, all the knowledge that we have about our donors could be coming from a different data source. So donation history could come from Salesforce. Our event attendance data might be coming from something like Microsoft Forms. Engagement could be coming from our CRM, HubSpot, and income data, same thing. We might be storing that in a different Salesforce table. One of the other big problems that happens as you're thinking about the generation step is just the question of, how do I go from, I have data in all these disparate places, they all live in their own little silo, it's hard for those pieces of data to actually talk to each other. How do I get all of them into the same place? And so once we think about, we've now collected data from each of those sources, step 2 has to do with, how do we get it into storage? What does that actually look like? So there's 2 pieces of this puzzle. The first is, where do I store that data? I can't store it in each one of those individual systems. They're all their own unique system. So that's something I have to consider. And then really the first question to think about is, how do I get it there? And we refer to that as the extract, transform, and load process. And we'll talk about that second, but that's often abbreviated as ETL, or sometimes as ELT. And there's a minutia of difference between those that isn't really worth thinking about for today. But those are the 2 major pieces that every organization has to think about. So let's talk about storage first and foremost, and how you should be thinking from a data strategy perspective about improving what your data storage looks like at your organization. I talked about that kind of central problem, that for this donor idea, they've got 3 or more data systems that they're looking at, none of which actually talk to each other. And so we need to figure out a way to make something like that happen. So the goal that you should be thinking about from a data strategy perspective is, how do I centralize my systems to make data both more accessible and more secure? One of the worst things that can happen is like the constant extracts. Like, oh, I've got to extract something from Salesforce and extract something from Forms and extract something from HubSpot. And now there's a million of those different files as a CSV or an Excel file all floating around, and it gets really messy really fast. That's probably a pain point that some of you have felt in the past before. It gets really hard to actually manage that. The typical evolution we see an organization go through, some organizations still have their storage on premise. They've got a server in a closet somewhere. That, of course, happens less and less and less frequently as organizations have moved towards cloud-based storage platforms. And that's like your productivity suite. So that's SharePoint and Office 365 and all of the things that go with that. And you might be downloading your files off of HubSpot and then going and uploading the CSV or the Excel file into some folder that you then have to go label in the cloud. It's specifically a cloud storage platform. The next step in terms of your evolution, particularly for data systems like that, I'm not saying get rid of the storage platforms like Office 365, but rather complement them with cloud-based storage infrastructure. And so infrastructure are now tools like Microsoft Azure that are going to allow you to store things in a centralized way with some governance on top of it to make sure that it's more secure and it's more accessible for more people in your organization, at least in a way that's going to make it easier for people to see things. Now, there are some pain points that you have probably run into that you should consider that might tell you it's time for me to think about moving on from this system. So one that I think about is the idea of, we call it the loan system trap. And that's, you all have probably encountered this. There's some really important data set, but the fundamental problem is that that data set just lives on one person's local computer. You just can't get access to it, or maybe they were at least better and they put it in OneDrive. That person just left, maybe for vacation. You need to get access to that system, but no one has the capacity to get to that data. And think of, there's variations of that as well. The other version that I alluded to, the other pain point, is when you start to get into that like email attachment chaos. So someone's downloaded the report from HubSpot, they've gone and done some math to it, and now you've got a version on your computer that says report V1 updated, and then someone else has to go make an update, and now it's called report updated 3 or report updated RMH, like someone put their initials on it. And it's really hard to actually tell what the right version of something is. That's a huge pain point for organizations and causes a lot of problems down the line. Or you might have this case where you've got some kind of dashboard, and dashboard means different things to different people. Your dashboard could just be an Excel file that has some KPIs in it, or maybe you've gone to something like Power BI. But in order to even make that happen in the first place, it just takes a lot of manual steps to make those things occur. And so if you want to get to that idea of, can I go predict which people are going to churn, you're going to end up with a huge problem, and the amount of time it takes you to do that is a lot. There's a bunch of other common pain points as well. We think of like no single source of truth. So there isn't the one spot where I can go to get the clearly correct data, or the data might live in different silos. So different parts of the organization only have access to certain data, or that's stuck in different tools, and the communication isn't there. You might not have versioning across things. So, right, the data set change, that's like the idea we were talking about. Data accessibility could be really limited. So people on your team might not have access to the right data, and that's can be really problematic. You might have to deal with lineage questions. In the absolute ideal case, you would be able to know from where the data started to where it ended, what are all the steps that happen to it in between, so that you can track it really closely. And that's something you could get audited on at some point. And you'd want to be clear that you have knowledge about that. You might be running into performance issues. How many of us have run into a problem with the gigantic Excel file? Because that's where we do our data work. We do it in Excel. Excel is an amazing tool, but it has its limitations. And it has thousands of rows, maybe getting to 1 million rows, or tens and tens of columns, or there's some like tons of tabs on it. And every time you've got to open up that poor Excel file, it takes like 10 minutes just to open it, or never mind adding something to it or adjusting a formula. You could have some governance problems, challenges where you're not sure who has ownership of the data and who's maintaining it, and that could lead to some downstream problems. Inconsistency, your data might be scaling with you. You might not have automation around the work you're doing, and now you've got people doing a ton of kind of menial tasks every month that you don't need them to do. It could be automated in some kind of way. So I'd love to take a second. I'm going to drop a poll in real quick on the slide. Take a minute. I'm curious to see which of these resonate with you. You should be able to go either use the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and it'll ask you for a number. That number is 2377169. You can pick as many of these as apply to you as you want, but I'd be curious for your own perspective, for your own organization, which are the pain points that I just talked about that you really feel, whether it's on a day-to-day, a month-to-month, a week-to-week basis. Take a minute and fill that out. Would love to get some thoughts there from folks. Just take a minute. We'll get going. Great. I'm starting to see some folks enter that. That's great. We'll just give a minute or two for people to go fill that out. So no single source of truth, data silos, some lack of version control, limited accessibility, no data lineage and audit trails, poor performance, poor governance, data inconsistency, lack of scalability, lack of automation. I'll start showing some of the responses in the next minute or so. Great, love to see a few people who are joining on that. That's phenomenal. But all of these issues could cause, like if you're experiencing some of these, that's a really, really good sign for yourself that you should start to think about a more advanced data system than you're currently using. So it's not just necessarily everything local or everything on a cloud storage system. It might be time to think about some cloud infrastructure to support you. Perfect. And I'm just going to go ahead. You can keep filling it out, but I always love seeing this come through. So interesting. The number one thing that's popping up so far, and this could change, it's a race, is, oh, now it's a three-way tie at the top. I'm seeing data silos, lack of automation, data inconsistency really jumping up to the top here. So that's a pain point for a lot of you. And that checks out. How frequently do we run into the problem where our data is in different systems and they just don't talk to each other? Or internally at your organization, like you have silos internal to your organization you've got to deal with. Automation is a huge issue. And certainly now as we're thinking about how can we optimize our time and optimize our resources, finding moments for automation, that's a really big deal. And data inconsistency, that's really what I was talking about in terms of garbage in, garbage out. The less consistent we are with our data, the less consistent our outputs on the analytics side are going to be. So really, really important concept there. And just looking down, right now, a lot of folks aren't jumping in or seeing those lack of scalability and poor performance issues. That could just mean that, right now you're right-sized in terms of the tools that you're using from a storage and capacity perspective, but that's something that could really grow over time and something to be thoughtful about. So really, really great to see those responses. So all of those are a really good reason that you might consider moving from a tool like SharePoint and complementing that with the tools that are available on Azure. We're going to talk about a few of those tools today, certainly, but I want to call out that there are like hundreds of tools you could be thinking about on Azure, all of which you might want to work with an expert on to figure out what you need and how you need to use it. You can make a whole career, turns out, just understanding all the elements of Azure. Azure is part of a suite of products that people colloquially call the cloud storage, cloud infrastructure in particular. And it offers a lot of advantages that are really helpful to think about. And while I feel pretty confident that everyone on this call has heard the term cloud before, I want to make sure that you understand why people think it's such a big deal and why people have invested so much in migrating to the cloud or using the cloud and why it could be beneficial for you. Certainly, it helps you think about those pain points that we just talked about, for sure. But there's a few others I want to call out. Number one is this idea of reliability. The reality of using a tool like this is that you are kind of functionally paying Microsoft to make sure that your databases are performant for you, or whatever your data infrastructure is. I'm using database very generally in this case. That you are going to have performance and access to that whenever you want to. If I contrast that with the scenario where you are the ones responsible for it, you're great, but you're also not a big machine that has data infrastructure engineers and architects who can really make sure that you have access to what you need whenever you need it. The scalability matters a lot as well. So cloud is going to allow you to scale as your resources grow. So while a lot of you didn't identify scale as being a particular problem for your organization where you're at now, one day it could. And so right now, that means you just pay for what you need. And as you grow, it's very easy to increase what that looks like without having to go out and buy new servers or do something along those lines. Microsoft's just doing that for you. That also makes all of this very maintainable, ultimately. Someone else is maintaining it for you. So while you need to be thoughtful about what you're doing in terms of setting up your own cloud infrastructure, the maintenance is ultimately falling to Microsoft, and they're going to guarantee certain uptimes and SLAs in terms of the work that they're doing, and that's really valuable. And last, it's very secure. So it's the same type of thing. Security is something where having a team of experts who are working on your behalf can be really, really valuable, and they're going to help make sure that compliance standards are met in a way that might not be possible for your team. So it's outsourcing that thinking in a way that's really meaningful and helps you focus on what's going to advance your mission and not get tied up in the nitty-gritty details of how to set up your architecture the right way. The other really important thing, this is particularly true of Azure, is that there are nonprofit credits that you would be able to use to help with your organization and deduct costs. I believe that those nonprofit credits are now $2,000 per year. You have to apply for that every year. But for most of the architecture that you all might be thinking about, that's actually going to get you a really long way in terms of covering those costs, if not totally covering them. That can, of course, grow and change over time. You certainly can't always count on those credits being there, but it's a huge benefit that our nonprofit partners take advantage of and pretty easy to set up ultimately as well. So something that you can count on to help make sure that you can consistently get what you need. Now, in terms of the type of data that you might have, I just want to quickly talk about two types of data. This is how we think about it. And each of them has different storage needs. And so I want you to think about the data that you have on your team and what you might want to put in the cloud. Fundamentally, we think about structured data and unstructured data. Structured data just refers to anything that's in a tabular format. So it's going to look like the spreadsheet that you have in Excel. You have your rows and your columns and your observations, and everything falls neatly into those little boxes. Unstructured data is functionally everything else. There is this other category called semi-structured that fits in between, but we're not going to concentrate on that too much. That could be PDF documents or just really any type of document that you might have. That could be pictures or videos. That could be email messages. But think of things that look like text or look like videos. They don't fit into the neat box of a table. And depending upon what you need to do, each of those has different needs in terms of how you might think about storing that data. And so different architectures on the cloud are going to help support you in different ways. Now, I don't know exactly what your organization's needs are, but you probably have a pretty good understanding of which of those is going to be most important for you. There's a lot of different type of data architectures to think about, but I'm going to concentrate in on 3 of them and not even go into super large detail. I mostly just want you to be familiar with this language more than anything else. So on one side of the spectrum, there's this idea of a data warehouse. And data warehouses are really designed for structured data. So that's if you have a lot of different structured data that's coming from different sources, that you are going to go clean it and get it ready for analytics inside of that warehouse. On the other side of the equation is something called a data lake. And in that case, you're going to have more unstructured data. And it's all going to come from different places. It's going to be pretty diverse. And you need to land it in that type of storage environment. And of course, we have this idea of a lake house, which blends the 2 of them. I'm also somewhat convinced, if you start looking this stuff up online, that really the way we name these things is it's like a body of water plus a type of like architecture, lake, house, for example. That's how we just name a lot of these. There's a few different variations for sure. In terms of using tools, we're going to talk about Fabric more in a second. Data warehouses and data lake houses are both options that you can build with inside of Fabric in particular, and really capture the most common use cases for the nonprofits that we run into. So that covers storage. High level on storage, things that you should be thinking about are, if you're hitting some of those pain points, it might be time for you to look at cloud infrastructure for where to store some of your most used data for analytics. And as part of that, there's a couple different types of infrastructures on Azure that you might want to consider: data warehouses and data lake houses. Now, the next question is, how do I actually get the data into those storage systems? And that goes back to this idea of extract, transform, and load. And so same thing, if we go back and look at that predicting donor churn concept, we said before that each of those data sources, or each of those pieces of data we want to use, comes from a different data source: Salesforce, Microsoft Forms, HubSpot, respectively. So how do I all actually get them into the same place? And I want to do that in a way that's going to minimize the likelihood of having junk data and minimize the pain, the time that my team has to take doing that. And so we need to build a pipeline to make that happen. And those pipelines are called extract, transform, and load pipelines, ETL pipelines. In all of these cases, we have our data source in the first place. We have to get the data source out. That's the extract step. We need to transform it into whatever way we want to store that data to make sure that it's going to be right for the analytics that we want to do. And then we have to load it into that storage system: the warehouse, the database, the data lake house, whatever it's going to be. But we want to make sure we get it there so that we can do that work. If we step through a little bit, there's some key questions that you would need to think about at this as you're building out a data strategy for yourself. First and foremost, the question you want to know is, like, what are the data sources that we as an organization even have? In this sample that we gave you 3, right? Salesforce, Forms, and HubSpot. You probably have a lot more than that, and they probably apply to a lot of different parts of your organization. You might have finance data that you want to end up in there. You might have program data. You might need to think about how those things need to interact with each other. You're going to want to think about, for each of those data sources, how often does the data change? Is it every hour? Is it every day? Is it every week, month, whatever it is? And that can be different, of course, for each one of the data sources you're going to use. All of them might be structured in a slightly different way as well. You're going to have to deal with that. The way you connect to that data can be a sticking point. Most modern systems have something called an API, or an application programming interface, which is what allows data systems to talk to each other. It really just allows anything, any code to talk to each other. You have to build those, but most modern systems come with those in place already. And so you've got to figure out, okay, can I use something like that? Or does the tool I have not have something like that? It doesn't have an API, and I need something else that's going to work in its stead. And you're going to need to figure out how to extract the data, right? It could be the API, it could be something else, but you've got to figure out what that ultimately looks like. So just to go through that example we gave you, like you might actually literally answer those questions as a good starting point for yourself. So for each of these, first I'd want to understand the update frequency. Well, something like donation history and event attendance and engagement with emails, that could feasibly change daily. But for your organization, perhaps the income data that you're going to go augment all of this with. So you want to know for each of your donors, how much household income do they have? What's their net worth? Whatever else it might be. That might be something that you only actually update yearly. And so right away, you probably need to do something different with that than you would with all the other ones. Now, the structure that the data comes from could also be different. You might not be familiar with JSON. JSON is simply another type of way to store data. It's very commonly used in software development as a way to make that happen, but pretty likely that all of those sources you can extract the data as JSON, and that's actually the preferred way for a lot of data engineering types of work. On the other hand, your Microsoft form, you could extract it as an Excel file or as a CSV, and that's great. So once again, there's a difference that we have to go deal with. Some of these all have an API. In fact, certainly Salesforce and HubSpot do. Microsoft Forms doesn't necessarily have an API, so you're just going to have to get it from Forms. And in terms of extracting it, there's different tools you might use to make that happen. So for the ones that have an API, great. We could use something like Azure Data Factory, which is a tool inside of Azure to get that data out. Whereas Microsoft Forms, maybe we need to use Python to make that happen. And I want to call out, this is a totally made up scenario, and I'm kind of purposefully forcing these differences just for us to think about that. This might not be how you would actually do it in practice for each of these, but still just having an understanding of these and perhaps working with someone to help you think about that is really, really valuable. So great, we've figured out the questions we want to answer on the extract step. Well, now I've got to go figure out the transform step. So I need to go have a good understanding of, all right, cool, we've got the data out of here. But what do I need to do with the data now to get it ready for analytics down the line? One big thing that you have to deal with, this goes back to the garbage in, garbage out concept, is how do I deal with any issues that exist in the data? One big one, particularly for numeric values you might deal with, are outliers. So what if it's supposed to be a number, someone's supposed to enter in a net worth, and that means the number theoretically could be anywhere from 1 to 10 million. What if someone adds an extra like 0 or 2 in there and their net worth is $1 billion? It's certainly possible, but it might not be likely. And so you have to figure out how to deal with things like that. You might also have missing data. So what do you do if someone just doesn't have a net worth entered in? Do you leave that blank? Do you set it as maybe the average of all the other people? So just assume that their net worth is like $1 million, for example. Do you set it to $0? How are you going to handle something along those lines? And there's lots and lots and other different types of ways to think about that, all of which are really specific to your business and your needs for whatever the data you're working with are. Is there validation to be considered? One big thing that I think a lot about in terms of validated data, I always think about addresses and states. So I live in the greater Philadelphia region. I live in Delaware specifically. Well, someone could absolutely enter in the state they live in. They could write DE. They might also write out Delaware. Or they might say that they live in Philly versus Philadelphia. Or they might just write Phil. How do I make sure that all of those things say the same thing so that I count all the Delawares the right way? And there might be a lot of other ways that that could happen. And so that's actually a question to think about all the way back at your source data potentially. I might think about aggregations. How do I need to aggregate it? Do I want to go calculate the average net income or average net worth, excuse me, for the people that I'm working with? How do I need to do that? What does that look like? Is there external data that I want to go and add with this that maybe I need to augment the data with? So a good example of that is our team very frequently works with census data and American Community Survey data. So I might want to know, hey, John Smith lives in zip code 19806. What's the average household income in 19806, and how does that compare to John Smith? Well, I need to go get that from somewhere. And I might need to figure out if that data needs to be joined or merged with other data. Okay, how am I actually doing that? In order to join the data together, I need to make sure that I have a common key between them. So I need to know a name or an ID number in both data sets, or a date, or whatever the common piece of information is across the board. Is it set up the right way? How am I going to make that happen? Big step with lots and lots of decisions in there. And last, I would go ahead and load the data in. So now I'm ready. I've answered the questions about extraction. I've answered the questions about transformation. Now I've got to go think about the storage component. So you would have answered this ahead of time, but literally, where am I storing this data? Is it going to go into that warehouse or that lake house? What is that going to actually look like? Are there specific ways that I need to get it organized so that I can go do the analytics work downstream? I'd want to know something about how big the data is going to be and how much to expect there. Are we talking about like a few megabytes worth of data or a few gigabytes worth of data? And to be clear, there's a factor of 1,000 in terms of size between those things, or maybe it's more than that. How's that data going to be loaded? So what happens when I get new data in? So when I'm doing that daily update or hourly update or whatever it is, does that mean I'm going to tack new data on at the end? Or do I need to go just reload the whole thing every single time? And what are the trade-offs in terms of what that looks like? And I also want to have some sense of quality assurance checks on this. So how do I know that that storage actually went well? What does that look like? How can I make sure that I feel really comfortable about my data quality? Remember, all of this is in service of the last step we thought about, which is the analytics piece. So I want to have great generation of data so that I can store data the right way, so that I can extract it and load it the right way. And now ultimately downstream, that means so that I can do analytics in a way that I feel comfortable with and that I can really feel valid in the work that I'm doing. Like I said, last week we talked about Azure AI Foundry as one way to do that. And we, of course, introduced Microsoft Fabric as a way to do that. The other tool that we mentioned, though, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these now, is Microsoft Synapse. And so both of these tools, Fabric and Synapse, cover some of the same steps here. They help with the storage, the extraction, the transforming, and the loading, and they also help with the analytics. And so one of the questions you might have here is, so how do I pick which of those tools I should use? Which is the right one? What's right-sized for my particular need as part of that? And the way that we think about it internally is that Azure Synapse is more technical and it's built for engineers, whereas Microsoft Fabric is a little bit less technical and it's built for analysts. So Synapse is going to be high code, whereas Fabric is low or no code. And Dharneesh gave you an example of that last time. There's trade-offs in terms of what that looks like. So if you're trying to build out one of these systems, Synapse is going to be really fine-grained. It's going to give you all the tools that you need to be able to do exactly what you want to do. You're going to be able to do it at a huge scale. Petabyte is a gigantic scale, ultimately. And it's really good for more enterprise use cases. It lets you build stuff the way that you need. I mentioned ETL versus ELT. Microsoft Fabric, in comparison, you've got a little bit less control. It's going to operate on a smaller scale, ultimately, more of a moderate scale. It's likely going to be a better use case for you to use in terms of self-service, and it has some built-in pipelines that you can think about too. If I were to generalize the trade-offs between them a little bit more, it's that Microsoft Fabric is going to take less time to become productive, but the contrast is that it's going to give up control. So if you need more control, you pick Synapse. If you want to get to work faster and get insights faster, you probably want to lean towards something like Fabric. Neither one is right or wrong. They're just a little bit different. Now, with that said, to help kind of summarize some of these items, I want to pass this over to Dharneesh so that they can come on and talk a little bit about those differences between Synapse and Fabric, particularly as it relates to what we were just talking about, the extract, transform, and load process. So with that said, Dharneesh, I'll tag over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, everyone. I'm Dharneesh, and I'm going to show you a quick demo on building ETL pipelines using Synapse and Fabric. So building on top of the donor scenario we have been using in this webinar, imagine you are a fundraising manager at a nonprofit, and every month you are asked same questions by your leadership team, such as how much money did we raise this month, which campaigns are performing best, and things like that. So you might have run into similar challenges or pain points that Ryan discussed previously. Working with Excel, with different versions of data, no single source of truth, data silos, and so on. So now let's see how these Microsoft tools can help you build like a strong data infrastructure. First, let's talk about Synapse. Azure Synapse is a platform that brings together data warehousing and big data analytics. It allows you to run queries on both structured and unstructured data without moving between two different or multiple systems. So firstly, we have created a storage account in Microsoft Azure. And for the demo purposes, we have curated a sample data set. So called campaigns, donations, donors, engagement. So those are the individual raw files that we have. We have stored everything in the data storage account. So next, let's switch to the Azure Synapse workspace. I would like to first show you the Knowledge Center. If you go to the gallery, you could see the templates for database and other things. So if you're a nonprofit and your sector is airlines or banking, you can have like a quick startup template to begin with. This is like really helpful. It has the schemas and the general guidelines for those sectors, which you can quickly use it to kickstart. And it also has like some pipeline use cases. So if you would like to do a bulk copy from database, or if you would like to delete files older than 30 days, so all those commonly used use cases are kind of templatized, and it's like been in the Synapse video. So we can leverage that. So coming back to our data set that we had, so in Synapse, we would like to do the ETL that Ryan mentioned. We need to extract the raw data and then do some transformations on top and then load it so that we can visualize. So let's go step by step. The first part is extracting. So here you could see the integration datasets. We are basically taking the dataset stored in the storage account and then integrating it into Synapse workspace. So the data is linked and it's like loaded into the Synapse. So, and if you see here, Azure Synapse comes with a wide variety of connectors. So if you would like to bring your data from Amazon S3 or SFTP or some other space, it has those connectors built out, and it makes it like really easy to bring in the data from different sources. So once we have the extracted data, the next is to do the transformations. So for transformations, Azure Synapse offers two options. One is Notebook. Notebook is like a high code version, so full on code. You'll be so in this scenario, we have used Spark. We have loaded the data and then did some column transformations or calculations, things like that. And then we have finally stored the clean version of it. So that's like the high code. And the second option it has is creating data flows. So this is kind of the mid-code version, I would say. And it's like easier and intuitive to work with. Here you can see the actual lineage or the pipeline flow. So here you could see the individual data sources, and we have done a couple of joins here, and then created like a master data set. And the final master data set is like stored in the sink. Um, so it's visually easy to understand. And also, it comes with an expression builder. You can use it to build your own expressions and add like calculated columns and things like that. So yeah, once the transformation is complete, the next step is it has an option to integrate with other pieces, like other services in Azure. So there might be some scenarios you would like your pipeline to talk with some Azure function or a Databricks or some other thing. So it has those ability to do that as well. And once your pipeline is ready, you have the trigger options here. Trigger is basically if you'd like to run the pipeline daily at 7 a.m. or you would like to trigger it based on a file change or a data change. It has multiple options for the triggers. So you can write cron jobs and make those triggers run. And also in the monitor tab, you can monitor the previous pipeline runs, the start end time, the status of the pipeline, and all those is like logged, and you can monitor it here. So yeah, now let's see the same scenario in Microsoft Fabric. So similar to the data set we had, here we are storing the data sets in SharePoint, and this is the Microsoft Fabric workspace. Here is the pipeline that we have here. So we take the file from SharePoint, we extract the contents, and then in the Fabric ETL data flow, that's where we do all the transformations, the data cleaning, and all those things are happening there. And later it's loaded into Lakehouse, and it's been connected to the Power BI dashboard, semantic model, and the dashboard. So that's the high level pipeline in Fabric. Now let's look at some individual pieces inside it. The second step is the transformation. So here in Fabric, it uses Power Query. It's kind of look and feels like an Excel, and it's much easier to use. So here you could see um, we have the donations. We go to the SharePoint and then take those files and do some typecasting here, and then replace a few values, true and false, and yeah, a few transformations here. So, and all the steps are captured in a sequential fashion. So you could debug and see the status of all those outputs previewed here. Yeah, and once the transformation is done, this is the Power BI data model. We connect those tables and we basically link those tables. So in this scenario, you could see donor ID is being linked from the donors table and the engagement table in a one-to-many fashion. Similarly, like all the other connections are made, and we have like a common date table for calendar purposes. So yeah, once we have the data ready, now we are using Power BI for visualization. We have a couple of sample reports created just to show a glimpse of what Power BI can do. Here is like a fundraising overview. You can have slices like whichever year you would like to see, and the top blocks are some KPIs, total donations, donors, and things like that. And we have the donations by year line chart. And one good thing about Power BI is like the visuals are interactive. So if you'd like to see just the green energy fund, if you click on it, all the other KPIs and the visuals will be filtering down to that particular fund, and you can get like a fine granular version of it. So how much total donations and all those related to that. So the next one we have is Donor 360. The table on the left gives like the donor names, occupation, and the state from which they have donated, and the total donations. So similarly, we have some year slices and preferred causes. and things like that. And we have the donor retention line chart and the total donations by state visualized in a map. So yeah, uh, Power BI helps you to measure impact, improve your operations, and tell the data story clearly. It helps you with data-driven decision making and helps with a lot of impact reporting. So based on the use case, uh, we can modify the reports to match it. So to summarize, I would like to have this analogy for Synapse and Fabric. So for Synapse, it's like renting an apartment. You get the walls, electricity, and plumbing, but you need to set up the Wi-Fi and organize your space and things like that. But for Fabric, it's like staying in a fully furnished Airbnb. Everything is like ready to use, furnitures, kitchen, TV, and everything. You can just move in and start using it. So that's like the high level difference between Fabric and Synapse. Um, so I will pass it over back to Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks, Dharneesh. Yeah, I really love that last analogy that you made there, the comparison of Synapse is like the apartment. You've got to do the work to set things up, but that means you have full customizability in terms of how you do it. You saw some of that with what Dharneesh was showing off. It's a little bit hard to perfectly see those things in there, but you have a lot more decision space in terms of what you're able to do, a lot more ability to get into the granularity of things. Whereas if I contrast that with Fabric, I love that Airbnb analogy. They've taken care of a lot of things for you, so you can just jump in and start doing things. Ultimately, what Dharneesh was showing off was in both of these cases, how do I go through those steps? We didn't quite show the data generation step because that's happening off screen, but how do I pull the data from different data sources, land them in a place to store it, be data that you have that's sensitive, that should really only be used for a specific purpose,